God, we thank you so much that you gave Jesus for us. And not only did you give him to die, but you raised him back to life. And through his resurrection, we can be raised to life because sin has been defeated. Death has no sting. So we ask God that you would empower us through the gospel, through Jesus, to change and to be more like Jesus. We ask this in his name. Amen.
So Hannah, my oldest daughter, she's 14 now. She loves butter. And she comes by it honestly because, I look at my family. When I was growing up, we grew up with certain Norwegian meals. I'm Norwegian, last name Olsen. So there's a certain number of Norwegian meals, and usually what's fascinating about Norwegian meals is at least from this perspective now, is when I look at it, pretty much what they are is glop until you add butter and sugar on it. Even really look at, lefse, which is, very Norwegian. Everyone loves lefse, but it's a potato tortilla until you put a bunch of butter and sugar on it, and then it's magical. But without the butter and sugar, the magic is a little bit lost. Well, I grew up on something we called, it's got several names, but basically it's called klub, okay? K-L-U-B-B, K-L-U-B, K-R, my grandpa used to call it krub, K-R-U-B, it's all the same stuff. But basically what this is ground up potatoes, flour and water, and you wad it into a ball. It's like paste that you go to school with and you glue paper together. This is what they use. This is how you make paste. But the difference of it is they actually would shove some spiced pork in the middle of it, and that's no one's favorite part. Well, I like it a lot, but it's really no one's favorite part. Everyone's favorite part is this big old glob, of potato. It's a potato dumpling, really, in a sense. And this is what it looks like, but this is, you lose its magic yet until it reaches your plate, because then once it reaches your plate, you put it into a big old spread. You cut it up and you chop it, and then everyone's given their own stick of butter. I know, it's not really exaggerating that much. You get your own stick of butter, and then you take that butter and you melt the butter over your potato dumpling, and it forms, I'm not kidding, a lake of butter. Okay? You envision you go to Red Lobster and they give you this little cup of butter, right? We serve this on big plates, and so you have this lake of butter, and then you have this potato dumpling all mashed into it, and it's just like, if that's not good enough, and then we frost it with sugar. Okay? So there's this blanket of white snow over the top of it. I'm telling you, we only have this once a year for a reason. Okay? Basically, and we have it right after deer hunting, and because we hope and we pray that we shoot something, because we recognize that by dragging that deer out of the woods, I am thus burning enough calories where I can now consume this without guilt. Okay, that's really what it boils down to. So my daughter comes by it honestly. It wouldn't be uncommon that after a meal like this with the lake of butter, that my grandfather would sit there, and if there was any butter left, he would take his knife and he'd lop off a chunk of the butter and he'd eat it. It was not uncommon. I mean, if butter was laying out, he would do this. It was a regular practice of his. He doesn't do that anymore because he passed away. Thanks for bringing that up. Anyway, so there's this time where my daughter, when she was about 4 years old, she's sitting at our kitchen island, and there's this tray of butter on the island. It's really the only thing there except for these flowers. They're fake flowers. I didn't get Sarah real flowers. So there's a butter dish, and then there's flowers over here. And I remember watching her, and she's sitting there looking at the butter. And she just stares at it for a while. And then she takes her finger, and you just see, she liked that. And so then she kind of decided to take a little bit more. So she kept going after the butter over and over and over again. And so it's kind of cute as a father, but there gets to be a point where you look at this like that's not healthy for her. And so it's like, well, I hate to do this, but I got to set the rules down. And I say, okay, Hannah, no, we don't stick our finger in the butter and eat the butter. And but it tastes good, and so you have this, I wouldn't say argument, but there's this bantering a little bit back and forth. And finally, so she knows now she's not supposed to take the butter. Well, this isn't the first time then, not the last time that it happened. So there's this other time then, I see her there, it's the butter dish. I'm watching her. It's such a bad thing for me. I recognize now that I was a bad father. Because I knew the butter dish was there, and I wanted to test her and see if she could resist the butter. A good father would not have allowed this to happen. I recognize now I'm not the good father. Okay, you thought I was, I'm not. All right, so watching her, she's 4 years old. She knows now that she's not supposed to take the butter, and I'm just watching her. And finally, she says, Dad, you're going to have to remove this butter dish because I can't control it. In other words, she recognizes the fact that if you leave this here, Dad, I'm going to eat the butter. I need you to do something. I need you to take this butter away from me. And we're going to see this picture this morning that really exemplifies that imagery. They're going to tie it together really well this morning. So we left off, if you remember last week, I was choking on cornstarch. Oh, that was so bad. My throat is still suffering from it. But we left off, we were talking about when Jesus comes in, it's his last meal with his disciples. It's, in a sense, his last night on earth before he is crucified, his last 24 hours to live. And what we find here then is this interaction. You're still looking at that? I'm sorry. He's his last 24 hours to live. And we see him pouring into now his disciples from John chapter 13 through John chapter 17, pouring in, these are my last 24 hours, this is the last message I have to you, and I'm just going to pour in this message, and this underlying message is love, 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 throughout the whole sequence. And so we know the fact that if Jesus is spending his last 24 hours, and this is the main message he wants to communicate, there's something significant to what he is saying. And we're going to see that for these next few weeks. The other element that we were reminded last week, one of the keys that we do not want to forget was this idea that it also showed that Jesus knew exactly, he was sovereign, he knew who was going to do what, he knew when they were going to do it, and that's important to note. And we're going to see some of those things fleshed out again this morning. The fact that Jesus knew and the fact that Jesus loves. And so we looked at it and we left off here. Remember John chapter 13, verse 2 last week. And it said, the evening meal, this was believed to be the Passover, was in progress. And the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Iscariot, to betray Jesus. A couple of interesting pieces here. We look at this idea of prompted. This word is used elsewhere in the New Testament, but this is the only time that I could find that it was actually used in this form as prompted. It's the same word that Mark chapter 4 uses when it talks about this man sowing seed, casting seed. The word casting and this word prompted is the same word used. It's the same word that John uses when describing when Jesus is encountering this woman who is caught in the sin of adultery, and Jesus says the words to those Jewish leaders, says, those without sin throw the first stone. It's the same word that we used here for the idea of prompted, because some people look at this idea of prompted in the sense of he's already engaged in it, he's already got it, he's already locked in. That's not the case. But the temptation has been thrown out there. The temptation has been scattered to him. It's fallen on him. And we're going to see this morning that when that seed of temptation, in a sense, falls on him, he's got to respond to it. And if we allow that seed of temptation to linger there, it's going to grow and it's going to blossom. And I'm convinced that that's what we saw with Judas. It's the same word that Jesus uses when he's talking to his disciples, and he says, cast your nets on the other side of the boat. It's the same word that is used. And so then we get into it and we look at it here. After Jesus has washed his feet, all 12 disciples, it's important to remember that. Even though he knew that Judas had already been tempted by Satan, even though he knew that Judas was going to betray him, Jesus still washed all 12 sets of feet. 24 feet later, he loved every one of them. He showed the full extent of his love. That was a precursor to what he's going to demonstrate on the cross. And here we pick it up then in John chapter 13, verse 13. So Jesus goes on. He has just said, do you understand what I have done for you? He asked the 12, do you understand the depth of the love that I have and how I have just expressed it to you? Now he's going to articulate that a little bit more. And here's what we have. He says, you, Jesus talking to his disciples, you call me teacher. Teacher, the idea of rabbi, and that's rightly so. You call me Lord, also. That makes sense. This is a step up. This is not just a teacher aspect. You call me Lord. In other words, you call me a master. You call me this higher up, if you will, this sovereign being. And you're right about both of those. He says, now that I, your Lord and teacher, in other words, I, your rabbi, I, your teacher, and I, your Lord, I, your master, have washed your feet, you should wash one another's feet. A lot of people look at this verse in particular through the ages, and they've kind of decided that this means then that we should also have a foot washing ceremony as part of like the Easter celebration. It's not mandating that you have a foot washing ceremony, because we see in the next verse it says, I have set an example. Jesus is saying this. I have set an example that you should do as I have done for you, not do what I have done. And that's important to note, because sometimes we look at what's happening here, and we kind of, all right, we got to do exactly this. Jesus is giving us this example. That we are supposed to live lives that are sacrificial. We are supposed to live lives in which we give of ourselves to others. In other words, it's kind of like this idea, we see it elsewhere, and we're going to find it here in John chapter 15 in a few weeks too, where Jesus says, no greater love has anyone than this, but that he would lay down his life for his friends. In other words, in our culture, we get that to an extent, but consider it like this, because he had just washed his disciples' feet full of dirt, full of literally animal dung as they're walking through the streets, and he goes down and he washes all of that junk off of their feet. For us, it would be like no greater love has anyone for this than he would go and change his neighbor's toilet. Let's think about it, okay? Because nobody likes to switch out your own toilet. Have you ever replaced a toilet? There's nothing fun about that. There's no pleasure. It's like, wow, this was a great job. Hey, can I come and switch your toilet too? Nobody wants to do that. I did have a friend one time, he asked for help on his toilet, and I had to swap out his toilet. And when I know nobody wants to talk about this, but we're talking about it right now, okay? So when you're going to switch out your toilet, you put on the hazmat suit as best as you can, okay? You have a mask on, you put the gloves on and things like that. You're dealing with your own junk. It's one thing, but there's something different about dealing with someone else's junk. You know what I'm getting at? There's a step up, if you will, and that's really what, in a sense, Jesus has done here. He's saying, I am willing to deal with your garbage, and he washed that garbage off of his disciples' feet. It's mind-blowing, and he says this, and this is how he follows it up. And this, keep the context in your mind here, because this is significant. He says, very truly I tell you, no servant, in other words, no disciple is greater than his rabbi, no servant is greater than his master, nor is a messenger greater than the one who sent him. But Jesus, the master and the teacher, put himself under his disciples and served them accordingly. And yet he's saying, you guys aren't better than me. Guess what? And I just slid it under you, and it was my own choice. And this is really, really humbling, mind-blowing stuff. Well, let's not lose this act of humility that Jesus is doing here. He says, now that you know these things, you'll be blessed if you do them. And it's not this idea of do this, don't do that. There's a heart thing here. Don't miss the heart piece. Because this is not about the self-righteousness, I'm doing the right things, I'm not doing the bad things. Okay? There's something so much deeper going on than just the do this, don't do that mentality. And then he goes on, and this is where the story kind of turns. It takes a turn, it flips. And so it says, Jesus says, I'm not referring to all of you. But catch this, I know, that's the K-N-O-W, I know those I have chosen. In other words, what Jesus is saying is, I didn't make a mistake in choosing the 12 of you. I know every one of you. I have chosen you. I chose you while you were still at the shore fishing. I chose you when you were still a tax collector. I made the decision that I wanted you to be with me. I chose you for that. I know who I have chosen, and we're going to see what he's going to then predict. But he understands this idea. He says, I'm not referring to all of you, yet I know those who I've chosen. And some people look at this and they pull on this idea, well, this is predestination. It's not. Because in this specific sense, what Jesus is saying is, I know those 12. That's the context that we're looking at. I know the 12 that I have chosen. Okay? So this is not going that direction that some people like to try to take it. That is not accurate. But this is to fulfill the scripture. He who shared my bread has turned against me. This is beautiful. This is a quote from Psalm 41. Look at this. So Jesus, in this interaction, keep in mind, Jesus knows who's going to betray him. Nobody else in that room does. It's important to differentiate that. Jesus knows who's going to betray him. And so this is what he says. He says, he who shared my bread has turned against me. And this is what it says here. Psalm 41, verse 9. This is what he's quoting. He says, even my close friend, this is a psalm of David. His third son, Absalom, has betrayed him. And that's where this psalm comes from. Okay? So David's heart in this matter is passionate. And David is saying, even my close friend, Absalom, and another one of his servants, who both would eat at the king's table, go to betray King David. So David understands this pain that Jesus is talking about. He says, even my close friend, someone I trusted, one who shared my bread, has turned against me. And that's what Jesus is pointing out in this psalm. It's the same thing. In other words, he says, you remember David when those betrayed him, that were closest to him, his own son betrayed him? Likewise, I'm about to be betrayed. Okay? And he says, I'm telling you now, I love this. He says, I'm telling you now before it happens, so that you know when it happens, that I am who I am. Now, that's an I am statement. I'm telling you all of this. I'm telling you about this betrayal so that when it does happen, you're going to see, wow, he was right. There must be something special about this guy. It'll be too late by then. However, it's an eye-opener. I'm telling you this now because when it happens, you're going to remember what I said, and you're going to say, wow, Jesus is who he said he is. He was the I am. So then he goes on to verse 20. It says, very truly I tell you, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me, and whoever accepts me accepts the one I sent. What we find here is Judas in this position. We know it because we've just read it. We know it because John has already given us those clues. The disciples don't know it. I'm not even convinced that Judas fully grasped it at that moment yet. And we're going to see that here in a little bit. But Jesus says very truly, whoever accepts anyone I send accepts me. So there's this idea, I've sent you, you accept him, you've accepted me. Well, Jesus was sent from the Father, and the disciples for the most part accepted him, but Judas has not. And so Judas has not accepted this plan. Judas has not accepted this God that has sent Jesus Christ. In verse 21, and after he had said this, he was troubled in spirit, and he testified. This idea of troubled in spirit, do you remember a few weeks back when Jesus was there at the tomb of Lazarus? This is one of the same words that's used in that moment when it says Jesus was stirred in spirit. Okay, he was deeply moved. Remember that word? There's this idea he was agitated at that moment, and he's agitated at this moment as well. He knows David, and he knows when David was betrayed, there was great pain involved. And here he has been. He knows who he has chosen. He has chosen all 12 of them. That doesn't mean he loves any one of them any less because he washed all of their feet. He showed the full extent of his love to every one of those 12 that are there with him. And yet now what we find is he is deeply troubled. He is agitated at the fact of what he's about to say next. He says, very truly, I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. This word betray, we look at this, well, what does it mean to betray? We can come up with some different scenarios. The literal translation of this word betray in this context right here literally means one of you is going to hand me over to the enemy. In a very literal sense, that's exactly what is being communicated here. One of you is going to hand me over to the Jewish leaders. And all the disciples, you remember, before they went to Lazarus, this was a few weeks ago, they're over in that area of Ephraim. All right? And they know that if they head back to Jerusalem, it's like, we can't go there. Remember, just before they're going to go Jesus raised Lazarus, Thomas said, okay, you're saying we're going to Jerusalem, then I guess we will go and die with you. Remember, those were his words. I guess we will go and die with you. They knew the consequence. They knew the context. They knew for a fact that if they go back to Jerusalem, people wanted to kill him. And now what you have is one of these 12 that were with them before they had gone back to raise Lazarus from the dead. Something has happened. He had this idea put into his head by the devil, saying he's been tempted, saying, all right, this guy isn't who you thought he was. He's not going to do what it is that you wanted him to do. You're following a dream. Leave it. That idea has already been put in Judas's mind. We don't know when that happened. It might have been when Mary poured that perfume. Could be. It could have been when, after that triumphal entry, everyone was like, yes, and Judas could have been like, yes, this is really happening. I am going to be with this guy who's going to be elevated to the king. Who knows where I'll end up in my political career? And yet he finds that Jesus has said, it's time for me to die. And Judas is going, wait a minute, that's not what I thought was really going to happen. I thought that, wait, something's different here because I thought I was going to be somewhere else after all of this stuff. Whatever it was that Satan used to prompt Judas, he has been tempted at this moment. But yet you see Jesus as he's interacting with his disciples. It's not too late. Jesus knows the decision, I'm convinced he knows the decision that Judas is going to make. So I don't want to diminish that. But God has this plan laid out, and God's plan does not include sin. It did not include sin from the beginning. That was not part of God's plan. So whenever we look at this idea of sin being part of God's plan, we're like, well, God put Judas there so that he would sin and do it. I don't buy that. Okay? And I know this is getting into some of those theological things that's very difficult. However, let's just pull it in and think through this idea. Okay, if God's plan is, in a sense, a sinless plan, and God's plan for Judas is not that he would fall into this. Judas is open to make a choice. Yes, Jesus knows exactly what choice he's going to make. Okay? He knows what choice he's going to make. That doesn't diminish the heart that Jesus has for Judas. The reality of it is, when we sin, I'm pretty convinced that God knows when we're going to sin. He knows that answer. And likewise, that's not part of his plan for us. He does not want us to fall into that lifestyle. Does that make sense? I'm away from my notes. I have no idea where I'm going. But he says, very truly I tell you, one of you is going to betray me. That is a bombshell moment right there in that upper room. Because look at this reaction. His disciples, after hearing that, they had no idea. Okay, John is writing this stuff. John, one of the disciples, the one who specified who Jesus loved, he's writing this stuff. This is all hindsight. He knows this all now, but at the time that this was taking place, John did not know who was going to betray him. John did not know that Peter was going to deny him. Okay? But now at this point here, look at what happens. Jesus just drops his bombshell. One of you is going to hand me over to the enemy. One of you is going to turn me in. And the disciples stared at one another at a loss to know which one he meant. You just see, I bet you could hear a pin drop after Jesus had said that. Here are these 12 like, what? Looking at each other. Is it going to be you? Wow. Is it going to be you? Not knowing who he meant. As a reminder before we move on, remember last week when Jesus was washing his disciples' feet, he got to Peter. Remember Peter's reaction? Lord, what in the world? You can't wash my feet. That's just wrong. That's not right. And Jesus kind of rebukes him and says, Peter, if I don't wash you, you have no part of me. That part meant inheritance, and said, you have nothing to do with me if you don't let me do that cleansing work. And Peter says, well, then by all means, do all of me. And he says, well, Peter, you're still missing it. You don't need to wash the feet. But it's important to note, because I think that rebuke plays into this here. It says, one of them, the disciple whom Jesus loved, that's John. When John writes this gospel, he refers to himself as the one that Jesus loved. There's two ways to look at it. Either John was Jesus' favorite. Come on, parents, we all have a favorite child, right? Yeah. Which one of my kids yesterday asked, who my favorite was? I picked one, I said, it's Carissa, whatever the name is. She's my favorite. What? Yeah, you ask, you're going to get the answer. Sorry. Truth tellers, Anyway, there's one way to look at it, that John was actually literally Jesus' favorite. I'm not convinced that that's the case. And that's not just because it doesn't feel right. I think there's something more on here where I look at John and the way he writes his gospel. I think what John is really communicating is this idea of, who am I to receive this love of Jesus Christ? And yet he's loved me. He refers to himself the one, that disciple that Jesus loved. Can you believe he loved this guy? I'm the disciple that he loved, and I had nothing lovable about me. You know, that's kind of the take that I pull in on it. So one of them, the disciple who Jesus loves, was reclining next to Jesus. So we don't know the whole order of where everyone's at, but in this idea, they're reclining at the table, they'd be down on their left elbow, feet out extended out behind them, and they'd eat with their right hand. We talked about this when Jesus was eating with Lazarus and the rest of the group that time. And then the table was usually a longer table. There'd be like 3 on an end, 3 on an end, and then they'd have the other 6, in the middle, and then Jesus would kind of be in the middle of it. Similar to like the Last Supper, but not exactly. Wherever it was, we get this idea, here's the picture. John is next to Jesus, okay? He's there next to him. But somewhere else, we're going to see Peter. And Peter is not next to Jesus, at least according to what's going on here, because of the language that we see here. Because the next one is, come on, there it is, Simon Peter. Motion, this idea of motion literally means nods his head. Okay? So get this imagery. So here's Jesus, we'll say in the middle. We've got John on one side, and we got Peter maybe down on one of the ends or something like this, making eye contact with John, and he's not willing to ask himself because he's already been rebuked. That's my idea on this, okay? I spoke up one time, and I kind of got shot down. I'm a little afraid to say something because it really made me look stupid. Okay? And so you have Peter, in a sense, on one end, making eye contact with John, and he nods to him and says, I mean, Jesus just dropped this bombshell. One of you is going to betray me, and here's Peter going, whoa. And so we get this, John will then ask. He says, so leaning back against Jesus, this is John, asked, Lord, who is it? This is not, I'm convinced, a question, or maybe more so the answer, isn't broadcast to everyone. I don't think everyone hears the answer for sure, let alone the question. And that's important to know because this is just very interesting. And the fact that John's writing this gospel, John now is in the know as he's asking this question, is going to get this answer. So here's John, and he leans back into Jesus and says, Jesus, who is it? And Jesus answers, and he says, it's the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish. Then dipping the piece of bread, he gave it to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. So I think, and you'll see the evidence here, I think what happens then is Jesus' answer says, it's the one I give this bread to. John might be the only one who heard it. Okay? Because we're going to see the evidence there. So just envision that then. So John asks him this question, and Jesus says, it's the one I'm going to give this bread to. So watch who I give this bread to. So he dips the bread. And he goes and he gives it to Simon Iscariot. And look at here now. It says, as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered him. And that's part of the reason where I feel like Judas had a choice. Up until this moment here, there was some freedom. There was some free will going on. He had been tempted, but something triggered here where Jesus perhaps then pulled back his protection. I don't know what all took place there. But this reality that at that moment when Judas ate the bread, it says Satan entered Judas at that moment. Okay? And then Jesus says this, and now I believe Jesus said this loud enough where everyone could hear. Jesus says to Judas then, what you're about to do quickly. Did Jesus talk to Judas, or did Jesus talk to Satan? Or both? I don't know. But think of it. Either one could be appropriate. Satan, what you're about to do, go get it done. It just shows who's in control, does it not? I mean, this is just mind-blowing stuff, really, when you look at it. And here's Jesus saying to Judas and or Satan or both, what you're about to do, go get it done. Try me. See what you end up with. But this is where, look at this. But no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to Judas. So Jesus says to Judas, and pull back, look at the context for without knowing. See, that's part of it. We know certain things. We've got to pull back and kind of look at it as if we didn't know. He says, but no one at the meal understood why Jesus said this to him. And many believed, we'll see it in the next verse here, but since Judas was in charge of the money, some thought Jesus was telling him to buy what was needed for the festival or to give something to the poor. So they hear, the disciples hear, Jesus say to Judas, what you're about to do, go do quickly. In other words, we're about ready to eat. Go get some food quickly and bring it back. In a sense, is kind of what some of the disciples believed that was going to happen. They did not know that Judas was about to go and sell Jesus and betray him. They did not know. And they will not know probably until Judas comes back to that Garden of Gethsemane and he encounters Jesus, and Jesus says, "What are you doing here? You come to betray me with a kiss." There's that word betray again. This is a powerful image here when you look at where Judas is at, the sovereignty that Jesus has over these circumstances. And then the final verse, it says, as soon as Judas had taken the bread, he went out, and it was night. I want to wrap up and pull in two metaphors that I find in Scripture, and I kind of want to put them together. And I recognize the fact that metaphors are metaphors, all right? Metaphors can break down if we kind of keep pressing them. So just kind of bear with me and work with me on this metaphor. Again, I kind of pretty much just plotted out as meaningless. That's not true. But in Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, this is 6 and 7, you remember the story of Cain. Cain killed his brother, all right? He was jealous of the fact that Abel's offering was acceptable to God and Cain's was not. And so Cain said, "That is not right. That is not fair. I will kill you, brother, because you are mean and nasty and I don't like you anymore." And so he says, then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry?" Cain is upset that he's getting punished. You know, it's fascinating when you're a parent and you raise children and you give them a consequence for their behavior and then they get upset. It's like, why are you upset? Because I'm getting in trouble. Right. So he says, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? Now catch this. If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now envision that same statement applying to Judas. Here is Judas. Satan has already tempted him. Satan is crouching at his door, ready to have him, ready to devour him. And certainly it looks like it's going to be devouring Christ. But that's you're missing it because it's this internal struggle within Judas that he has a choice to make. And if he chooses one, he will be freeing himself from sin. If he chooses the other, he'll be diving into the sin. And then I want to compare it to this metaphor we find in Revelation chapter 3. So in Revelation chapter 3, that's where John, the same authors we're dealing with here now, has this vision, has this revelation from God. And Jesus Christ, in his revelation, speaks these words to him, but it's referring to these 7 churches. He sends out this letter to 7 churches. One of these churches is Laodicea. Laodicea was kind of in a mountainous region, but it had this, where they were plotted, they had these natural hot springs just to the south of Laodicea. And up in the mountains, they had basically nice cool water that would flow down. And what would end up happening is that those waters would meet in Laodicea, and it would just form this kind of lukewarm, stagnant pool. Okay? And when in this stagnant pool, so they would have recognized this imagery, and Jesus says to this church in Laodicea, you are neither hot springs, good. You're neither cold water, refreshing, good. Rather, you're stagnant. I've given you something, and it's just fallen and it's stagnant. There's nothing attractive about it. There's nothing good. There's nothing people would want that you have to offer. All you are is a lukewarm pool. And so he pulls in that picture. But then he says this, and we misunderstand this passage to be that which Jesus is knocking on the door of an unbeliever's heart, someone who has not yet said yes to Jesus, but that is not the context of this verse. This verse is in the context of being addressed to those who have already said yes to Jesus, but they're finding themselves in this stagnant, I've got nothing good, nothing valuable to really offer to people. And so here we have, Jesus says, here I am, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person and they with me. So here's the metaphor. We look at the idea of the door. All right? We see Judas, and we'll put Judas on one side of the door, and here he has sin crouching at his door, ready to devour him. And yet, on the opposite side of the door, you have Jesus, who's knocking. And Judas is standing here. He's got a choice to make. Will I open the door and let Jesus do that work? Will I let him do something in the inside? Will I let him do that work in my heart, taking that heart from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh, so that I have something to offer to people? Judas kept that door closed. I'm convinced that Jesus was knocking at that door. Jesus knew I'm not diminishing Jesus' sovereignty. Jesus knew that Judas would not open that door. But that didn't mean that Jesus didn't want him to. And here we find ourselves now. We're at a door. Sin is crouching at your door. And the language that we see when it says that the devil had already prompted Judas, likewise, the devil has already prompted you. You got to think, let's be honest. You got to think about where you're at. Every one of us can find a piece to this right now that applies. Every one of us can relate to this right now because there is a sin crouching at our door. Many of us know what it is. Some of us are denying that it's even there. Some of us will acknowledge, no, that's not sin, that's good. And yet what we do is we keep this door closed. And all the while, Jesus is here and he's knocking. You got to let me in. You got sin crouching at your door. It's going to have you, but you got to make the choice to open the door, to let me come in and deal with the sin that is there. Because the reality of it is, sometimes it's a heart issue. We talk about, we have these self-righteous, this idea of do this, don't do that things, but some of that boils down into this reality of where our heart is at. Is your heart ready for the Lord to do this work? Or are you hardening yourself? It's like, no, I'm so angry. And angerness is there, crouching at your door, ready to have you. Bitterness is there, crouching at your door, ready to have you. Pride is huge. And we diminish the idea and the sin of pride. Because I am convinced that pride is a sin. Because Jesus could have been proud. And yet he humbled himself and asked us to do likewise. Okay? And there's the obvious ones. We look at sexual immorality, debauchery. We see all those written in Galatians. Those are certainly there and they're obvious. But what we need to do is come to this point of recognizing, stop calling sin good, and start saying, I got sin crouching at my door. And when we hear that knocking, we open the door and let Jesus do that which only he can do, to come in and do that life-changing work. That verse, behold, I stand at the door and knock, that's for those who have already said yes. If you have never said yes, this is a great day to start. It's a great day to start. If you've already said yes to Jesus, today's a great day to say, yep, that's sin down there. And I can't deal with it on my own. Did Judas try to deal with it on his own? I don't know if he tried to deal with it at all. But he let that stay there. He kept that door closed, and he was devoured. In closing, look at this in James. It says, James 1, starting in verse 13, it says this, when tempted, James lays this out. James was the brother of Jesus Christ. So he was with him. He was often, throughout most of his life, he was not a believer. He was not a follower of Christ. But there came to a moment where he said yes to Jesus. And he recognized then this fact that now I have said yes to him. I have to open that door and let Jesus do this work. But this is what it shows. It says when tempted. In other words, you got sin crouching at your door. When you're tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires. Here's this idea, crouching at the door, ready to grab you, ready to grab hold and drag you away. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. You see this in the life of Judas. He was prompted. He let it linger. He dwelt on it. He thought about it, and it expanded, and it gave birth to sin. And then sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. Jesus is knocking at the door saying, let me take that away. Let me deal with your sin. You can't do it on your own. Open the door and let him deal with your sin. Sin that maybe you've been dealing with for a long time. That's his job. I'm going to invite Lane and the worship team to come up as we close.
You stand, we'll sing the song we've just sang before the sermon. We'll come to the altar. you come to the end of yourself? Do you thirst for a drink from the well? Jesus is calling. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Leave behind your regrets and mistakes. Come today, there's no reason to wait. Jesus is calling. Are you listening? Bring your sorrows and trade them for joy. From the ashes a new life is born. Jesus is calling. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, what a Savior! Isn't He wonderful? Sing hallelujah! Christ is risen. Bow down before Him, for He is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah! Christ is risen. Oh, what a Savior! Isn't He wonderful? Sing hallelujah! Christ is risen. Bow down before Him, for He is Lord of all. Sing hallelujah! Christ is risen. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Oh, come to the altar. The Father's arms are open wide. Forgiveness was bought with the precious blood of Jesus Christ. Bear your cross as you wait for the crown. Tell the world of the treasures you found. Maybe some of you feeling Lord's been stirring altars up there. I invite you to come afterwards and you can
pray. We can have elders available to pray with you. But the question we have to be able to wrestle with and ask ourselves is, what sin is crouching at your door? Because you know for a fact that Satan's not going to go through this life without throwing something at you. So let's call it what it is and identify what sin is crouching at our door. And then it's time, will you open the door and say, Jesus, I can't deal with this on my own. I need you to do it. The altar is open for that this morning. So we invite you to come. If you're not coming, I just invite you to, go quietly, because there may be some that choose to come and to spend some time wrestling with some of these things between them and the Lord. So may you go and see that Jesus, who's knocking at your door, wants to come in and do that work, to change that heart from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh. Amen.